The air in the Lamar Valley doesn't just blow, it carves. At 60 or perhaps 70, the years start to blur when you live by the sun. The cold feels less like weather and more like an old debt coming due. Osborne Russell felt it in his marrow. His hands, mapped with the scars of 1,000 skinning knives and the blue-black stains of frozen gunpowder, trembled slightly as he checked the primping of his rifle. It wasn't fear. It was the heavy, rhythmic fatigue of a man who had outlived his era. He wasn't alone, but in the wilderness, every man is an island. Beside him stood Silas, a younger man with eyes still bright with the poison of hope, and Thaddeus, whose grey beard was a tangled thicket of a decade's worth of mountain dust. They were mountain men, a title the newspapers back east polished into gold, but here it just meant they were tired, salt-caked, and perpetually hungry. The morning was unnervingly beautiful. The frost on the tall grass looked like shattered diamonds, and the river hummed a low, mournful tune. Then the world broke. A single crack, sharp as a snapping bone, echoed from the tree line. "Down!" Osborne roared, his voice like grinding gravel. But the warning was swallowed by a chorus of war cries that didn't sound human. They sounded like the wind itself had turned predatory. 50 Blackfeet warriors emerged from the ridge like a dark tide. They didn't just attack, they flowed. Osborne felt a sudden hot iron punch through his thigh. He collapsed, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of red and grey. The pain wasn't a sharp sting, it was an anchor, dragging him down into the frozen mud. "Osborne, get up!" Thaddeus screamed, firing blindly into the tree line. Osborne looked down at his leg. Blood, bright, oxygen-rich and terrifyingly warm, was blooming through his buckskins, steaming in the sub-zero air. He tried to stand, but his knee buckled. He was a predator turned prey in the heartbeat of a second. He saw Silas take an arrow to the shoulder and vanish into the brush. He saw Thaddeus get cut off by a wall of obsidian-tipped spears. He was alone. With his rifle as a crutch, Osborne began to crawl. Every inch was a betrayal of his body. The high peaks of the Rockies loomed over him, indifferent and ancient. To the Blackfeet on the ridge, he was a dying ember. To the mountains, he was just another layer of dust. He reached the edge of a jagged ravine. Behind him, the thud of moccasined feet grew louder. He could smell the bare grease and the smoke of their fires. He looked back one last time, his vision blurring. He didn't see enemies, he saw the end of a long, weary road. He didn't want to die in a hole, but his body was screaming for the peace of the earth. He rolled down the scree, over the jagged stones that tore at his clothes and skin. Osborne Russell plummeted toward the frozen stream below. He hit the water like a stone, the cold so intense it felt like fire. He didn't scream. He didn't have the breath left for it. As he drifted under the shadow of a fallen cedar, he looked up through the crystal-clear water at the ridge. 50 shadows stood silhouetted against the dying sun. They waited. He waited. And in the silence of the Lamar Valley, Osborne Russell began the long process of refusing to die. Before we continue our journey into the wild, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? The darkness under the cedar log was not just the absence of light, it was a heavy, suffocating shroud. Osborne lay there, half submerged in the glacial runoff, his wounded leg throbbing with a heartbeat of its own, a dull, rhythmic reminder that he was still anchored to this world. The Blackfeet had moved on, convinced perhaps that no man of his years could survive such a fall into the belly of the mountain. They were right to think so. Any rational man would have let the current take him. But Osborne Russell was not a rational man. He was a man of memories. As the fever began its slow, insidious crawl into his mind, the biting cold of the Lamar Valley started to recede, replaced by the phantom warmth of a hearth thousands of miles and a lifetime away. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he wasn't smelling the iron scent of his own blood. He was smelling dried lavender and fresh-baked bread. He saw Martha. She was standing in the doorway of a small cabin in Maine, the sunlight catching the silver threads in her hair. She looked at him not with the pity the world shows a broken old man, but with the steady, unwavering love that had been his only compass for 40 years. He remembered the feel of her hand, not calloused like his, but soft, even after years of tending the garden and mending his tattered spirits. "Why do you keep going back to the high places, Osborne?" she had asked him once, her voice a low melody that now echoed against the canyon walls. "The mountains don't have a heart. They won't mourn you when you're gone." He hadn't had an answer then. He only knew that the horizon called to something restless in his soul. But now, shivering in the mud, the answer felt bitter. He had traded the warmth of her bed for the indifference of the frost. He had traded the laughter of his grandchildren for the scream of the mountain lion. He reached out a trembling hand, trying to touch the hem of her apron in his mind, but his fingers only brushed the jagged ice forming at the water's edge. The contrast was a physical blow. In his memory, he was young, strong, and capable of protecting everything he loved. In reality, he was a man whose boots were worn through, whose rifle was lost in the brush, and whose body felt like a house with the windows broken out, letting the winter in. He thought of Silas and Thaddeus. Were they lying in the tall grass, their eyes turned toward a sky they would never see again? The guilt was a different kind of wound, deeper than the one in his thigh. A leader is supposed to be the shield, the one who carries the weight so the younger ones don't have to. He felt he had failed them. He felt the accumulated weight of every friend he had buried in the mountain soil over the last 30 years. Each name was a stone in his pack, and today the pack felt too heavy to carry. A memory of a summer evening flashed by, the smell of pine needles, the taste of wild berries, the way the mountains looked like purple velvet under a harvest moon. It had been beautiful once. It had been a playground for giants. Now it was just a graveyard. "Just a little longer, Osborne," he whispered to himself, his voice a ghost of a sound. He wasn't sure if he was talking to his heart or to the memory of Martha. He realized then that the pain was a gift. As long as he felt the fire in his leg and the ice in his lungs, he wasn't a memory yet. He was still a man. He dragged his wounded limb out of the water, the movement agonizingly slow. He had to move, not because he feared the Blackfeet, and not because he still loved the hunt. He moved because Martha was waiting in the silence of his mind, and he refused to let her wait in a place as cold as this. He would carry her memory to a higher ridge, to a place where the sun might actually reach them one last time. Isolation in the high country is not merely being alone. It is a heavy, physical presence that sits on your chest and steals your breath. As Osborne dragged his mangled body further into the labyrinth of the jagged peaks, the world became unnervingly quiet. There were no birds here, no rustle of small game, only the rhythmic, agonizing hiss of his own breath and the occasional groan of a glacier shifting miles away. He had reached the dead zones, altitudes where the air is thin and survival is a minute-by-minute negotiation with the elements. Behind him, he knew the Blackfeet were still there. They didn't need to shout or run. They were trackers who understood that a wounded man is like a leaking vessel. Eventually, the strength simply runs out. He could feel their eyes on the back of his neck, a phantom pressure that kept him moving, even when his vision began to tunnel into darkness. The silence began to play tricks on his mind. He would hear the faint sound of a fiddle, a tune from a campfire 20 years ago, only to realize it was just the wind whistling through a crack in the granite. He would turn his head, expecting to see Silas limping behind him, but there was only the vast, indifferent expanse of white and gray. His leg had gone from a burning fire to a dull, wooden numbness. This was the true threat. In the wilderness, pain is your friend. It tells you you're still alive. Numbness is the herald of the end. He looked at his hands. They were the color of the stones around him, the knuckles swollen and purple. He had lost his flint and steel during the fall. No fire, no warmth, just the predatory cold that waited for him to stop for even a second. "One more step, Thaddeus," he muttered, forgetting for a moment that Thaddeus was gone. He was talking to the ghosts now. The psychological pressure was a crushing weight. He was a speck of dust on a canvas of infinite white. He realized that if he died here, his bones would not be found for a century. He would become part of the mountain, his story silenced by the snow. The thought of being forgotten, of his entire life of struggle, love, and resilience being erased by a single winter storm, was more terrifying than the obsidian points of the Blackfeet arrows. He found a shallow overhang, barely wide enough to shield him from the wind. He sat, clutching his wounded leg, and watched the ridge. 50 warriors. He saw them for a fleeting second, dark silhouettes against the blinding white of a distant snowfield. They were patient. They were the mountain's hounds, and they were closing the circle. He had no powder left that wasn't damp. His knife was dull. He was an old man with a broken body and a heart full of shadows. The silence seemed to roar in his ears, a deafening reminder of his insignificance. But in that silence, a spark of defiance flickered. It was the stubborn, irrational pride of the frontier. They wanted him to lay down. The mountains wanted him to sleep. Osborne Russell gripped a sharp piece of obsidian he had found in the dirt. If he couldn't fire a rifle, he would use the very bones of the earth to defend his right to breathe. He stared into the white void, his eyes bloodshot and weary, but filled with a terrifying clarity. The hunt was not over, and the mountains would have to work harder if they wanted to claim his soul. The sun began to dip behind the serrated teeth of the peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. Osborne knew the rhythm of the mountain. Night was not a time of rest here, it was a time of execution. He reached the summit of a narrow, wind-swept pass, a place where the earth seemed to fall away into a bottomless gorge of shadow. He turned, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. There, lining the ridge he had just crossed, were the warriors. 50 of them. They didn't charge, they didn't scream. They stood like statues of dark cedar, watching the old man who had led them on a chase through the gates of hell itself. They were waiting for him to fall. They were waiting for the mountain to finish what their arrows had started. Osborne's leg was no longer a part of him. It was a heavy, dead weight he dragged through the snow, leaving a dark, stuttering trail of red behind him. He reached the highest point of the pass and collapsed against a monolith of granite. His lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. Suddenly, the lead warrior, a man with a face etched like the canyon walls, stepped forward. He raised a hand, signaling his men to hold. He looked at Osborne, not with the hatred of an enemy, but with a terrifying, silent respect. He saw the gray beard, the shattered limb, and the way the old man still gripped his empty rifle as if it were a scepter of power. "I am still here," Osborne wheezed, the words barely audible over the howling wind. He knew this was it, the final stand. He didn't have the strength to run, and he didn't have the tools to fight. But he had his dignity, and he had the memories of the men who had died, so he could get this far. With a groan that sounded like the earth itself cracking, Osborne forced himself to his feet. He used the granite wall to pull his broken body upright. He stood, swaying a ghost in tattered buckskins, facing 50 of the greatest warriors the plains had ever known. He threw his empty rifle aside. It was useless now. Instead, he reached into his belt and pulled out his skinning knife, the same one he had used to carve out a living for 30 years. He held it with a hand that did not shake. The warriors moved. They began to descend the ridge, a slow, methodical advance. Osborne didn't blink. He felt a strange, cold peace wash over him. In his mind, the roar of the wind became the sound of a distant river, and the faces of the warriors blurred into the faces of every man he had ever loved and lost. "Come then," he roared, a sound that defied his age and his agony. It was a primal cry, a rejection of the grave. As the first warrior reached the base of the pass, Osborne didn't wait. He threw himself forward, not with the grace of a young man, but with the desperate, bone-crushing weight of a falling tree. He collided with the lead scout, the two of them spiraling into the deep powder. Osborne felt a knife graze his ribs, felt the hot breath of his opponent, but he didn't stop. He fought with his teeth, his nails, his elbows, using the last of his life's fire to protect the small space of ground he stood upon. They swarmed him. He felt the weight of bodies, the strike of clubs, the cold bite of steel. He was being buried under the tide. But even as the darkness closed in, he felt a surge of something more powerful than survival. It was the realization that he was dying a free man. He was not a victim. He was a legend in the making. Just as the final blow seemed ready to fall, a massive shelf of snow, disturbed by the violence of the struggle, groaned above them. A low rumble, like 1,000 freight trains, shook the very foundation of the mountain. The avalanche. The warriors froze. In the wilderness, there is no rank, no war, no ego. There is only the law of the heights. They turned and fled back toward the ridge, scattering like leaves before a storm. Osborne lay in the center of the path, looking up as a wall of white death descended toward him. He smiled. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight. The snow hit. It didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a cold, white blanket being pulled over a tired child. The world went silent. The pain vanished. The Lamar Valley reclaimed its own. Osborne Russell awoke to a silence so profound it felt like he had been cast into the void between stars. He was buried, pinned under a crushing weight of snow and debris, yet he was alive. The avalanche had not swept him into the abyss. It had encased him in a tomb of ice that paradoxically shielded him from the killing wind above. His first breath was a struggle, thin, metallic, and freezing. He felt the pressure against his chest, the mountain's final attempt to squeeze the last of the air from his lungs. But as he lay there, trapped in the cold dark, the agony in his leg began to change. It wasn't the sharp fire of the hunt anymore. It was a dull, echoing thrum, like the vibration of a distant bell. He began to dig. It was a slow, agonizing process. His fingernails tore, his frozen fingers felt like sticks of brittle wood, and every inch of progress cost him a gallon of sweat that immediately turned to ice on his skin. But as he clawed through the packed snow, a strange sense of peace settled over him. The desperation was gone. He had looked into the eyes of 50 warriors and the face of the mountain itself, and he was still drawing breath. When his hand finally broke the surface, the moonlight hit his skin like a physical blow. He pulled himself out into the night air, gasping, a silver-bearded specter rising from a grave of white. The ridge was empty. The Blackfeet were gone, perhaps swept away by the same slide, or perhaps they had finally accepted that some men are simply not meant to be taken. The Lamar Valley lay below him, bathed in an eerie, ethereal blue. Osborne looked at his hands. They were ruined. He looked at the valley, where he had lost his friends, his gear, and a piece of his soul. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, hollowed-out acceptance. The wilderness had taken everything from him, and in return, it had given him back his life, stripped of all pretension. He found a stout branch of wind-blown pine to serve as a crutch. He didn't have a map, a gun, or a companion. He had only the North Star and the memory of a woman's voice. He began to walk. Each step was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a slow, limping march across a landscape that wanted him dead. He wasn't walking toward a conquest. He wasn't walking toward gold. He was walking toward the simple, quiet dignity of finishing the journey. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but he wore it now like a badge of honor. He had survived the high peaks, and in the crucible of that isolation, he had found a peace that the world of men could never provide. Osborne Russell did not ride back into the world of men on a white horse. He crawled back, a skeletal shadow of a man who had left his youth and his friends in the frozen dirt of the Lamar. When he finally reached the gates of Fort Hall, his skin was the color of old parchment, and his eyes held 1,000-yard stare that made even the hardest veterans look away. He had survived, yes, but survival at such a cost is a heavy crown to wear. When we look back at the history of the high peaks, we often get lost in the maps and the numbers. We forget that the frontier was built on the broken bones of men who had no audience for their suffering. The story of Osborne Russell isn't just about a mountain man outrunning an ambush. It is a meditation on the human soul's refusal to be extinguished. It's about the dignity found in the long walk, the period of life where the body begins to fail, the friends begin to vanish, and the only thing left is the quiet, iron-willed command to take one more step. For our elders, the warriors on the ridge, aren't always men with bows. Sometimes they are the ghosts of who we used to be, the regrets of words left unsaid, and the physical toll of a life spent in the wind. Osborne teaches us that the greatest act of bravery isn't the shot fired in the heat of battle. It is the choice to keep breathing when the world has already written your obituary. His legacy isn't written in gold or monuments. It is written in the silence of the high country, in the resilience we inherit from those who came before us. We are the sons and daughters of survivors. We carry the grit of men who faced 50 warriors with an empty rifle and a heart full of memories. In the end, the mountains didn't break Osborne Russell. They merely polished him down to the diamond core of what it means to be a man. The dust has settled on the Lamar Valley, and the names of Silas and Thaddeus have faded into the whispers of the pines. But as long as we remember the man who refused to stay buried, the spirit of the frontier remains alive. It lives in every person who stands their ground when the odds are impossible. It lives in you. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us here at Wildbound History. If you believe the spirit of the frontier still lives, hit the like button and subscribe for our next survival story. Until next time, stay wild.